All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, February 9th. And do you want to talk about the Super Bowl today, or you have something else on your mind?
I have something else on my mind.
All
The
right.
one thing that is not on my mind is the Super Bowl.
Okay. Well, it
Yeah.
wasn't a good game anyways.
Okay.
What's on your mind? What do you want to start with?
Well, yeah, there are all kinds of things to talk about. Maybe we'll just start very briefly with Gaza. Again, it's I think it's important just for people not to forget that this is ongoing. There was an important piece of news just the other day, and that is that the IDF acknowledged that the statistics that have been compiled by the Gaza Ministry of Health, the statistics on direct fatalities in the war, people that have been killed by bullets or bombs by the IDF, that is correct. They said it's an accurate count. And there have been efforts by various Israel supporters. Often they say, how can you trust these? Obviously this is a Hamas-run institution, and we know that they're inflating and lying. And now the IDF, it says, okay, this is correct. Now we're talking, the official count is over 70,000. It's something like 71,000. And my reaction upon hearing that, and I noticed some other analysts reach the same conclusion, is that, okay, why did the IDF do that? Is it they just all of a sudden bout of honesty, a show of respect for Hamas? No, of course not. I think it's because they know it's actually much higher. And this is actually, it's probably good to say, okay, yeah, let's admit to 70,000. We'll stick with that. And when these further studies come out, people get in there and start digging through the rubble and checking all the records, they'll find out it's, we're talking about, again, direct fatalities, not indirect, but direct, that it's twice that or something. That's my strong suspicion. Because in fact, NGOs, some very well-regarded ones like Lancet at various times during, the 2 years of the Gaza genocide, did do very careful studies, and they, all agreed that, again, the Ministry of Health is very diligent. They're very careful. And then even when there are some cases when clearly actually, they undercounted, but they just didn't have the evidence. They could have, they knew there had to be more casualties, but because there was some, actually just a procedural or paperwork mistakes, they struck a number of names from the lists, for example. They're very, very rigorous in their methodology, and that's always been true. It's been true in previous conflicts, and that's one reason why, by and large, international media has been reporting this, because they know that they have a very good reputation. The thing is that, yeah, they can't get to all the bodies, and they, have been under attack themselves. So many of the hospitals have been destroyed. So many medical staff personnel have been killed. There are so many bodies under the rubble, entire families wiped out, nobody to even report the deaths in many cases. So there's just inevitably going to be an undercount. And the undercount goes anywhere, from by 10%, or, maybe the actual count is many of at least a few of the NGOs say maybe 40% higher than what is actually being reported, what has been recorded and verified by the Ministry of Health in Gaza. So we may very well be talking about, over 100,000, easily. Some of them say even higher in direct deaths. Now, again, this is a point that I've made before, that in any conflict, actually the indirect deaths, they almost always, outweigh or are far greater or far greater than the direct deaths. And why is that? It's because, health facilities are destroyed, as clearly happened in this, or, people don't have access to water, or food, and all these things are very true of what's happened in Gaza, to an extreme degree. So mortality rates go up. People that are already sick don't get health care, they don't get enough food, they don't get clean water, or they're exposed to the elements, and we all know the horrors that they've been experiencing. So in general, if you look at past conflicts, the ratio between direct deaths, again, people killed by bullets and bombs, and indirect is anywhere from 4 to 15. So if you have, let's say, 100,000 people, 100,000 who've actually died, are victims of direct violence, you can get anywhere from 400,000 to 1,500,000. So actually saying 400,000 indirect deaths, and then you add on 100, a total of 500,000 dead in this conflict is a very reasonable estimate. And there was, again, I think it was Lancet actually earlier into the conflict had made a higher estimate of 680,000. That was with, only halfway through, or maybe it was the spring of last year or something when they made that estimate. So anyway, that's something to keep in mind. Again, the Israelis are not letting in journalists. They haven't let in any journalists at all. They keep on, they don't want them in there, and they're not allowing equipment that could be used to, clear the rubble in. So we're not getting the counts that are, the real accurate figures. But eventually I think it's going to come out. And we'll see the true horror, the true scale of the horror when that happens.
You think that we will get an actual number? Or, if Israel has complete control over the area and they have they control 58% of Gaza, something like this?
Yeah, something like that.
So, wouldn't they have the incentive to destroy the evidence if they don't allow journalists in? It's completely controlled. When they just try to bury the bodies, mass unmarked graves, and then we would never get a full count?
It's certainly possible. It's, again, we'll see. Obviously they're very resistant to the implementation of the second stage. The Rafah crossing was finally opened, but only, well past, the date appointed by the peace plan. It should have been opened, more than 100 days ago. And they finally opened it a few days, about a week ago. But they've only allowed a few people through. I think 15 one way, 50 the other way. 50 were allowed to leave. Patients. Again, there's something like 22,000 that are in urgent need of medical care outside of Gaza. They only let 50 out, 15 in. And then they shut it down. As far as I know, it's now shut down again. So, people are not being let in. They're resisting the implementation of the second phase of this peace plan. Another part of that is, again, there's this technocratic committee made up of Palestinians that is supposed to oversee the reconstruction. It's led by a gentleman by the name of Ali Shah, who has a background in the Palestinian Authority, Al-Fatah, but he is approved of by Hamas too. And there's a group of 12 of them that are supposed to go in there and begin the reconstruction work, again, according to the peace plan, but they haven't been allowed in. They've been told that they can't go through the Rafah crossing. So the Israelis are just putting up roadblocks everywhere.
If the IDF admits to 71,000 deaths, has there been much of a reaction amongst the Western media? Like, oh my goodness, this is too high of a number when we know that the majority of these deaths are women and children, or there really hasn't been anything, right? I haven't seen much of a change
right.
So then the question is like, have we just come to this point where we're just going to ignore it, that the death count doesn't matter anymore? Like, even if it is there a point where it becomes unacceptable to the world and that the Western media just can't ignore it? Like, if we say, all right, it looks like you've killed 50% of the people there, majority women and children. Will something happen? Or we've reached this point where it's just like, these are just numbers. They're just statistics. And they're completely lacking in any human emotion anymore, and just empathy.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid that's true. Again, of so many of our elites in the West, they obviously don't care. If they did, they would have broken ranks, and we've seen that just hasn't happened. They're not people at the very top anyway. There have been brave, lower level officials and UN officials, but by and large, it's clear that the deaths of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Palestinians just do not matter to these people. They clearly does not. I mean, it's remarkable. I was struck by, we've commented on the fact that the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank has really picked up pace ever since, October 7th. And, but it gets very little attention because of the horrors in Gaza. One example is, it was just back in, last month, that the Israelis bulldozed the UNRWA, UNRWA, headquarters. That's the UN Relief Works Agency headquarters. Just bulldozed it in Jerusalem. And there was hardly a peep of protest. You see, what other country is going to bulldoze the headquarters of a UN agency? Again, this is really not on their own territory either. We're talking about this is occupied, East Jerusalem. But they did it, and I saw that there was some protests, I think, from Canada, Spain, and France, if I remember correctly. But that was it. And, I think the Israelis probably disregarded them. They know that those protests don't have any teeth. There won't be any consequences for them. But just thinking, I think even a couple of years ago, prior to October 7th, if they had done something like that, there would have been an outcry, and we would have heard about it in even the mainstream press, even here in the U.S., and there would be some condemnations and so forth. There would have been maybe some real pushback. But it's just they have gone so far that these kind of things, which would in normal times or semi-normal times would be considered real outrages, are just ignored. And it just seems like we've become numb to this. And I guess that's why I feel like I just want to start off with this. Let's not be numb to this. Let's just say this is wrong. This is not normal. This has got to stop.
Right. And being numb to it is it's a product of the media, the information that we're absorbing, the way that things are framed. And when I just was thinking, when you look back in history, there were so many horrific tragedies, but they end up being just a footnote in history. Even things recently, like the Rwanda genocide, a horrific thing where they were butchering people up with machetes, or the Armenian genocide. We don't really talk about these, but of course, the one that is immortalized, of course, is the Holocaust. That one gets all the attention. And I just feel like the Israelis kind of understand that these atrocities, they can just end up being footnotes in history. As long as we have the framing, as long as the narrative in the media's control, we can because there are always horrible things happening, and the way which one you shine the light on and ignore this one. At least I think that's the idea. But the problem is now, thanks to social media, I don't know if they can succeed. And I don't think that Gaza will be a footnote in history. It will be the mark of the permanent stain of the destruction, I think, of Israel, and the permanent stain on the Western world because of our complicity in this, willing to allow it to happen, and to allow the Israelis to try to control the narrative and convince us this is just a statistic. But it's the same thing as well with the Ukraine war. I mean, we forget about it as well. I mean, there might be over 1 million Ukrainians dead and wounded. That's what I'm hearing. And it's just, you once it gets to a certain number, you're just it becomes a history book number. You know what I mean? That's then that's the problem. And then that's how we look at it. And we're not looking at this horrific tragedy of these men and women that are men that are being forced conscripted in Ukraine, and seeing this, at least within Gaza, we can see because it's so many women and children, I think it's harder to bury that human emotion, that human tie to it. And I think that Israel's in real trouble. They're not going to be able to make Gaza a footnote in history.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I certainly hope you're right. There are, one example is in Turkey, I guess in Istanbul, a Gaza genocide museum was established. Like we have these Holocaust museums, but that's established. And I've heard, Westerners have gone through there and said it really is horrifying. I mean, it's just like we've gotten little snippets, the occasional image or, a bit of footage or something. And it strikes you, how can this happen? This is horrible. But it's all brought together. And I guess it's just a very emotionally wrenching experience if you go through that. Now, of course, there's a political aspect to that too, because, of course, they don't talk about their Armenian genocide that was carried out by the Turks. But but it just shows, this is one example of where, we may see that, okay, this memory will be preserved, and this is a stain that I don't think is ever going to be wiped, from the face of Israel.
Yeah, I think it's important to preserve those memories, especially in the region, so that to remind people of where the end result of some of these ideologies are and how monsters dwell within regular people and they can come out of these situations. I think it would be great. I mean, could that happen in the United States where we could fund a Gaza genocide museum? Or there's no way, right? They would get that shut down somehow.
I think so. That's right. I think so. But maybe some in the not so distant future will be possible. Like we've said, I think this Gaza genocide has unleashed forces that can result in the demise of that Zionist control.
I would like to see that in this country because we are, we enabled this genocide. Our role needs to be documented, and we need to learn from it and understand, like, well, how did this happen and what the result of this was, and not forget it and try to just sweep it under the rug. That's the thing I guess I fear the most often when I think about Gaza. Is sometimes I wake up like, is Israel just going to get away with this? And then I think they can't. I think they've gone too far, and there's all these other things happening as well. That even if it isn't just Gaza, I mean, with AIPAC and the Epstein scandal, all this stuff is also everything around TPSUA and Charlie Kirk. I think they've crossed the Rubicon. So I just feel like that just means things are going to get pretty weird here in the U.S.
Yeah, they're pretty weird already.
Yeah, well, okay. Well, is there anything else you want to add on to what I said or anything about Gaza?
Yeah, I think that's enough. There's plenty to be said, but there are a lot of other things that we need to talk about. Much is going on, in the rest of the world.
We'll just go carrying on with things getting a little bit weird. I think this Wednesday will be an interesting day because this is when Netanyahu is supposed to be meeting with Trump.
Right.
And I think we'll always come back to this question, is Israel in charge or is the U.S. Trump really in charge? And I think this will be another test for us to see. So far, it seems like Israel gets its way. That's the way I'm looking at it. Is that the way you're viewing it?
Yeah, well, I don't see why that armada would be off the coast of Iran if it wasn't for Israel. That Trump would have gone this far. We wouldn't have this, antagonistic relationship with Iran if it wasn't for Israel. There just would be no need to it. Actually, there are a lot of reasons for us to cooperate with Iran. Namely, like, for example, we do have a common problem with the Takfiris, with the Sunni extremists. The ones who brought down the towers, on September 11th. No,
those are the good guys. That's why they're in charge of Al Qaeda, and we invite them to New York. You have to. We changed, okay. We changed position on that. Don't forget.
Yeah. Okay. So. Well, not officially, but it just it would have made a lot of sense because again, the majority of victims of this kind of violence, this jihadi violence again, are Shia, and so. Yeah, we don't, maybe there's no need to have an alliance, but there certainly would be a need to make eminent sense to cooperate with Iran. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to constantly, demonize and, seek their overthrow. I think quite the reverse. The chaos that could result if you actually succeeded in that, would not be helpful for anybody but Israel. That's what it comes down to, except for Israel.
Don't you think that a lot of these Sunni extremist groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda, these are really kind of offshoots of Mossad and the CIA? And
I wouldn't say that. I mean, clearly
maybe not offshoots involved, encouraged, utilized by them.
Yeah, that certainly has happened. There's no question about that. There's no question that that's happened, and is probably continuing to happen to this day. But they're not actual creations. They are, they are products of their own culture. That they do have a history, a sectarian history within the Sunni regions of the Middle East.
I think they've been cultivated to some extent as well.
Yeah. No, we know that. Yeah.
Right. So that's the answer, right? That's why. I mean, it would make sense, right? It would make sense, but we seem to like to use the bad guys. We like to find the extremists and use them to our advantage.
Right. And so for Israel, their adversary is Iran. They want to weaken Iran. They want to break it apart. And they see these Sunni extremists as actually useful tools and weapons in that fight. Because they think, they see them as crazies, people who will never actually be able to run successfully, a powerful state that could actually oppose them. And it's also very easy, like if they manage to succeed, too much and begin to impose their way of life, too obviously, then they, in a way that might threaten Israel, then it's easy to put a target on them. Look at the crazies, now we got America go after them, even though you helped you and America helped to build them up, but it's easy to do that. Iran or the Baathist countries like Iraq under Saddam Hussein or, Syria under Assad, those were competently run. I'm not to say that everything was perfect and there weren't, serious human rights violations at different times, but they were competently run countries and they performed, they posed a real challenge to Israeli power, and so they see it in their sense. They just want to be surrounded by either compliant vassals, and if they can't do that, just broken countries, dysfunctional countries that can't pose a threat to them. That's the Israeli, that's the Israeli strategy. That's the greater Israel strategy. But there's no reason that we should be taking part in that. That just doesn't make any sense for us. Not at all.
Right. But we are taking part in it.
We are. So right there you see, Israeli influence. I don't think we would be there. That Armada wouldn't be there if it wasn't for Israeli influence. Now, there is some, it's not like Trump just simply is, receives orders and he just obeys. No, sometimes he pushes back. And, we saw that in the initial ceasefires, around the time that he took office. But that didn't last. And in the end, Netanyahu got his way. And I think it's the same thing. I don't think Netanyahu didn't really want this peace plan. The first part of it was fine. They did that. The Hamas kept its side of the bargain. The Israelis, of course, didn't keep their side of the bargain, or only kept, a quarter of it or something. But they have no intention of implementing the second phase. And they figure they know Trump. Trump does these things impulsively, and sometimes he does things that they don't want, and Netanyahu and his government don't want to see happen. But they have all these levers that they can use to apply pressure to him. And because he does it, he's just not a consistent thinker. He doesn't think things through. He does things impulsively. And then you work on and eventually get him back to where you want him to be. And I think that's, this visit in Wednesday is just part of that. I've seen, actually, this is what was reported in the Israeli press. It's either Netanyahu going there trying to get Trump to persuade him to do that. Perhaps Trump is actually hesitating. That's not impossible. We've talked about that. He's got reasons to hesitate because the Iranians could do real damage. And Netanyahu's decided that this is something he wants to happen now. As soon as once there are enough air defense assets in place, and I guess they're being installed as we speak, he wants Trump to go ahead with this. He's hoping that he can just wait it out, pretend that Israel had nothing to do with this, and not suffer any consequences. But he's prepared, I think, clearly to suffer consequences. Okay, maybe some hundreds of people die, thousands of people die in Israel, but it would still be a great achievement in his mind, and it would get everybody thinking about forgetting about the second phase of the peace plan too. I think that's to his advantage. So he may be just trying to persuade him. The other possibility is that he doesn't need to persuade him. It's already agreed upon. They have a plan, and he's just going there to coordinate with them. I think he's bringing like the future Air Force commander of Israel with him, and so that maybe is all that's happening.
Okay, so it's clear that Israel wants this war, wants the U.S. to engage Iran militarily.
Yeah.
There's no doubt in your mind that that's not what's happening now, right? Israel, because there was that just a little bit. Israel was like, well, we'll hold off, maybe we're not ready. But now it seems clear that this is the goal.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that is clear. Just a few weeks ago, and it's been reported in many places, not just in Western media, but among the Israelis, it's just well known that Netanyahu asked Trump to hold off after asking him to start it, when he realized, ooh, whoa, we're just too exposed. Now these THAADs or, Patriot systems that come in may not do nearly as much as he imagines they'll do, but at least he can tell his people, look, I did everything I could to protect you or something. But now, all the signals are that they're for it. They don't want they do not want these negotiations to go ahead in any meaningful way. So they're insisting that the Americans demand, for example, the missile restrictions and end to the alliances, all those things that are just Iran will never do. Now, Iran and zero enrichment, and again, that's something that Iran has said again and again. We're not doing that, But Iran has shown flexibility, as we saw with the JCPOA, when it comes to like varying levels of inspection and enrichment levels. They say, okay, we can talk about this. We can, restrict the enrichment level. We can have this inspection regime. Now there are going to be problems, again with the IAEA, but maybe there's something that can be worked out and they can get another party involved or whatever. But they're willing to talk about that and work out some kind of deal. I think there was some news came out that said, okay, we have this 60% enriched uranium. We're willing to dilute that, back down to some much lower level. That would be an example, the sort of things that the Iranians have always shown a willingness to deal on. But Netanyahu and his people are saying that, that's not nearly enough. You got to do this, zero enrichment, no missiles, no allies. And those are all just kind of deal killers. That means no negotiations, basically.
And so then just the question is that we always get back to is just how much leverage does Israel Netanyahu have over the United States? If Trump does realize he's getting some sound information from the Pentagon that, this is going to be bad, we're not going to be able to do a one and done, this isn't going to be a Venezuela operation, we're going to get hit, this will be a bigger war. And if Trump doesn't like that, and then it's just, the question is how much control do they have? Is the is the Epstein stuff, is that going to be, is that part of their leverage? Will they push that blackmail? Like, at what point, how far will Netanyahu and Israel go to be overtly showing their pressure? Because that's the problem that I think Netanyahu is being a bit too cavalier with, is that people are realizing, like, hey, there's way too much influence and pressure coming from this guy, this state. And if it gets to a point where he shows up at the White House and then Trump is like, I don't really want to do it, and he's voicing it a bit, and then all of a sudden there's another little Epstein leak or something that's like, you know what, it's time to go to war. Let's do it. Hoorah, let's go. And then everybody's like, okay, well, that's not okay. That's not all right, right? That in itself will be a death sentence to Israel, because everyone's like, whoa. What is happening here? This is not right.
Yeah, right. I thought like maybe the one document that I felt was most significant from the recent document dump was the one that said that Trump, according to some informant, was compromised by Israel. And he very well may be. But even without that, like I've said before, they have a lot of ways to apply pressure to him. It's just the mega donors, Miriam Adelson just being the main one, but also, but also just on, he's, a lot of people said that Trump gets a lot of his information from Fox News. He seems to believe it more than he does his, his own intelligence advisors. So recently, or constantly, I guess, over the last few weeks, you've had these people like General Keane and others constantly saying, what's this talk of nonsense about negotiations? We just got to go in there and start killing. We got to overthrow this brutal regime. That's what he's hearing, and the suggestion that if you don't do that, you're like Obama or something. That's got to affect him too. I mean, there are a lot of ways in which pressure is being applied. And that kind of pressure probably really matters to him.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how much influence the mega donors have because, part of the appeal of Trump in the beginning was that, oh, he can't be bought because he's a billionaire. Wasn't that the whole point? So, like, how is it that somebody can throw $100 million at it, at a campaign like this and then all of a sudden just completely destroy the United States with it, completely, overtake the U.S. interest for Israel's interest just with that? With $100 million, I mean, yeah, it's a lot of money for us everyday folks, but for these people, it's nothing. It's chump change. And what did they get in return? Tens of billions of dollars in aids and contracts, and
but it's not
whatever.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but that doesn't come out of Trump's pocket. It's just
but I'm still saying, like, you would sacrifice everything for that amount, money. No, I feel like that's why I think the Epstein blackmail, has more weight as well to it. It's just like, okay.
Well, no, man, it's just been long true that it's clear. I mean, why does Apex donate all this money? It's not out of the goodness of their hearts. It's because they know they get control. They get leverage by doing that.
Right.
It does work.
But now that it's being out in the open and we're being pushed to do something that's so contrary to America's interests, I mean, there's clearly something here with the Epstein stuff.
No, it's interesting. It is, again, a light is being it is shining on AIPAC in a way that it never has before. And that has caused AIPAC to actually resort to kind of sneaky approaches. They've created these shell AIPACs. So they put money in there and then those donate to the candidates. So it's not immediately apparent that candidate is receiving AIPAC money. So this is the kind they understand. I mean, it shows that they are, their position has changed. They have been weakened, by this exposure, and that's good. And that's something that we should celebrate. But they are crafty and they're using these other means.
Do you think that a problem also coming in the United States is that maybe it's more of a generational gap and stuff, but that people are living on different planets, of information planets. I just kind of realized that because I'll just be, talking to somebody. I'm like, what? You don't know that the U.S. is being run by cannibalistic, satanic pedophiles, or what? It's like, and then I realize, like, wait, I sound totally insane right now, right? I'm like, I'm a crazy person, right, for saying this. But then I'm like, I'm not that crazy, It's just like, how do we explain things in an easy way that's easy for people? Like, this happens sometimes also with when I talk about the Ukraine war, just because I realize I've gone down my own journey of understanding and discovery on these topics, and other people have gone down a completely different path. And it's hard to bridge that gap for me sometimes.
Oh, it is. Yeah, no, it's just, that's the nature of the media landscape and therefore the political landscape these days. People live in different, information environments. And I try to keep a foot, of course I get most of my information from what we call, I call dissident geopolitical media. But I try to keep a foot in the mainstream, and I, read articles there from the New York Times or other mainstream sources, CNN or whatever. And I am struck by, sometimes it is just jarring going back and forth between them because those are two very different realities. And it's very, very easy, like, again, I have good friends who are very intelligent, very well informed. But yeah, they inhabit that mainstream reality. They have been getting their news from, let's say, MSNBC and the New York Times. And these are, intelligent people like the New York Times writers. They're, they have mastery of the English language, and they know how to put together an argument and to create a reality. And it's just like, if you just read that, if you're really, really thinking hard, you start to notice that there's some problems, or that occasionally there's something that doesn't fit into the narrative. And I think, people really should have an obligation when they see those things to go and investigate further, because it's so easy to do these days. You can get other sources and research. But most people, even very smart people, they have busy lives and they kind of just depend on it. And then, so it's just, so it becomes, evil Russia against brave democratic Ukraine. And, the Netanyahu's kind of a bad guy, he's unfortunately, but But Hamas is the real evil, and if there have been too many civilian deaths, but it's that's war. It's a sort of thing, collateral damage. There are a few bad apples in the IDF, but the IDF and Zionism, those are all the sound institutions or a movement, and it's just that's the message that you'll get if you stay there, and if you don't really think hard and perform your own research and look at other sources, that's where you'll be. Now, that crowd, I think, is increasingly small. It's interestingly, it's often the people that should be the best informed are, I think, often the least informed, because that's the establishment narrative and the elite narrative, people that are graduates of top schools in the country, by and large, actually tend to rely on that kind of information. But I think that's changing. First of all, I think that's the older generation, like my generation, and the younger generation is not falling into that as readily. And, we see that split, like among American secular Jews, where the younger people are increasingly very anti-Zionists, but the older ones are still part of that, that old narrative. But it's happening on other fronts as well. But yeah, we just have this very, very fractured, polarized media landscape, and it does feed into our politics. And yeah, sometimes it just feels like, you try talking to somebody, you think you're talking to somebody on another planet, and he thinks you're on another planet too. I mean, that's the way it is now.
Yeah, well, we are. Well, do you have any tips then on how to if somebody is completing the mainstream establishment narrative on the conflict in Ukraine or with Iran, Palestine?
Well, I can actually point some things out, like what my mother has done, who, she lives in Berkeley, California, and there you do have there are a large number of people that have actually kind of had their eyes opened about Israel and Zionism. But by and large, you still get this Russophobia there. It's going to be quite extreme, and they just assume that Putin's the devil, and and that we need to support the brave democratic Ukrainians, and that's the way it is. And so she'll say things, and about, well, for example, mentioned very proudly that her granddaughter is living in Russia, and people are shocked, and they say, but and it just leads to a conversation where she says, no, it's just what you've been told is not true. And what she'll do is like recommend that they go and maybe watch a video by an interview of Jeffrey Sachs or John Mearsheimer, and it's worked, at least in a couple of cases recently. People that assumed that Putin was a monster, they came back and said, well, maybe he's not such a good guy, but yeah, I kind of see that there are two sides to this. And there's a real shift in their thinking on it. So it can be done. Maybe that's one good thing, is to just think of, find somebody, because again, like Jeffrey Sachs and Mearsheimer, these are people that are, actually part of the elite in so many ways. And they used to be constantly interviewed, and, they were, highly regarded professors. In the case of Jeffrey Sachs, he's an advisor to presidents and prime ministers, and he still is, So you can't just say, oh, there's some weird guy in his basement, or some dude like me, that just spouting off, or what, so it does seem to work as a way of opening people's eyes. And of course, they also, if you run into the opposite problem in different parts of the country, sometimes you have people that are friendly to the Russians, but they still stand by the Israelis. Those two people, again, are very good.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a good idea, to recommend somebody that can explain it in a calm, easy to understand, rational, humane point of view. Yeah. Often, sometimes when I'm in these arguments, I'll just kind of get heated and go a little over, and then I'll be thinking about like, it's like, oh man, or I'll be in arguments like, only if my dad was here, he would say it in a way that you'd understand, instead of, that's the problem. Okay, well let's go back to the Iran negotiations and where you think this is headed. So, to me, it sounds like we are just on the fast track to war. I've heard that Iran has changed its military posture from a defensive posture to an offensive posture. Is this significant? Does that actually is it just saying that we got our fingers on the trigger and that we're ready to go at any moment?
I don't know. I think that that's probably what it is. That they understand it's like when they can't just wait and take a beating, then that they'll be weakened and they won't be able to respond so forcefully. They need to have, their finger on the trigger. And if they see the missiles and the aircraft incoming, they really should fire them, right away, because then they can do the maximum damage. And they have to let the Americans and Israelis know that they've got their finger on the trigger, and hopefully that can act as a deterrent. I don't know that it will, but unfortunately, I think probably it will not. It just seems like, there are just too many obstacles in the way to a solution. There's just no need for this, but it looks like that's where we're headed.
I know you hate giving odds and percentages, but it just sounds like this is it. We're coming to this, right? You don't see an off ramp, or you see it's very unlikely.
It's not. It seems very unlikely. I mean, it's just like I've said, there are two things that are going against it. One is the obvious pressure coming from Netanyahu and his government, and he clearly does have just a lot of levers. And again, it's not like it's Trump himself has made himself vulnerable. Let's set Epstein aside and all that, but just it's by the people that he's put around him. The people that are on Fox News. It's just like everybody is pushing him in that direction, and he can be. He occasionally does have his moments of independence, but we see again and again that he can be pushed. And, especially I think when it comes to Israel. And then say, well, even if he does declare his independence and say, no, I ain't doing this, because this is going to be really, really bad. And it's not going to help me. It's not going to help the Republicans in the midterm elections, et cetera, et cetera. I can't do this. We got to make a deal. I just don't think that there's almost just a lack of competence right there. If you really, and there's already such a deep, deep mistrust on the part of the Iranians that you're going to actually have to go farther than you would have gone, you were prepared to go before. You're probably going to have to go farther than the JCPOA went. One thing the Iranians are saying, and I think this is very reasonable, is that, we want to have the sanctions relief up front. We've got to see that that's passed by Congress and that it's really going to happen, because we were, deceived last time.
That'll never happen. Yeah.
So you're just looking at that. But you can see why the Iranians would demand that, because, they have been lied to in the past, more than once. It just seems like the obstacles are overwhelming. They're obstacles of our own making, and of Trump's in particular. So even if he doesn't want to, I don't think he really seems to have painted himself into a corner. Now, you never can say it's impossible. Trump sometimes just surprises us. He turns around. We look at that on Greenland, but Greenland's different because there wasn't people constantly telling him, Trump, you got to do this. You got to do this. Right. Even on Fox News, I think there was something like, what's this all about? We're not quite sure what's going on here. But in this case, you do have those people around him saying, you got to do this. You've got to do this. And he's made it so difficult to extricate himself. He's brought the Armada there. He's made these declarations, and now it's going to be very, very hard for him to back down.
Yeah, I was just thinking with Venezuela, did other than making us look like a global mafia, did it actually accomplish anything? Can we say that there was anything victorious in that operation? I mean, I think Trump is running off that high, but if we just look at it in terms of a geopolitical calculation, did we actually change the balance of things? Or
well, I mean, it's put real severe pressure on Cuba. Venezuela is no longer supplying oil to them, and then Trump threatened Mexico. That was the country that stepped into the gap and started providing some oil to Cuba, and he threatened them with tariffs in his usual manner. And so Mexico has stopped exporting oil to Cuba. Now Cuba's in a real jam. You can say from the point of view of just domination of the hemisphere, it was successful. Now it hasn't really changed like the political makeup of the Venezuelan government. And then there was all that talk about democracy and whatever. And then once the abduction was carried out, you just said, oh, no, Machado doesn't have any real support, which is probably true. She has the support of a minority of people. There's an acknowledgement that actually the government, it does reflect the popular will, and they just so that hasn't changed. But that government, they know they're weak and they have to proceed very carefully. Their oil tankers are being seized and just stolen. The oil is simply stolen. I guess it's sold and the money goes to some fund set up under Trump himself personally, not the U.S. Treasury, and then they get back some share of it. I mean, the whole thing is just so extraordinary. Again, any one of these things would be huge news, and it would be a huge scandal in any past years. But there's so many things happening now that we can't even keep track of it. So Venezuela has not, the government hasn't fallen, it hasn't kowtowed to the U.S., but it is aware of its own weakness and is treading very carefully. One thing I think it's really a failure on the part of so many Latin American countries that failed to stand by Venezuela. You just said, well, there were these differences. Lula didn't like Maduro and whatever. Let's just say, so what? If you have a power of behaving this way so recklessly and aggressively, you can't just let that power, pick off its opponents one by one. In the end, it's going to be you. That's at risk. And this is something that we're seeing. It's not just in Latin America, but you arguably around the world.
Yeah, I think people are coming to that conclusion now. But I mean, we're kind of Monday, night quarterbacking here with, we didn't expect this kidnapping.
We were expecting an attack.
We were expecting something, some kind, but we didn't. I don't think anybody was expecting this type of kidnapping operation with zero casualties. That there wouldn't. People were expecting there to be some type of fight. I think.
Yeah. Well, over 100 Venezuelans were killed in it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, American casualties. Of course, I don't want to diminish anything on the other side. Yeah. It's just. I think I've heard somebody call it a catastrophic success, that Venezuela operation, because I really just do feel like Trump has this belief in the U.S. military that is unjustified, and then that's going to lead him into this thing with Iran. It's like we didn't lose a single man in Venezuela. This will be, we can do this all over again. We'll just make it bigger and badder. And then
I think that's a real danger. I think that's right.
The thing is, once this thing kicks off, it's just going to go off the rails immediately. It's not going to be like the Ukraine war where there was this sort of careful escalation and this long drawn out, maybe it's better that it doesn't go that way, because if we look at what's going on in Ukraine, I mean, it's been going on so long and so many people have died, but I just see this instantly, because this is a missile war, and there are U.S. bases that are just targets that are there. Those are all going to get hit. Israel, tiny country, all of its military bases and infrastructure and all these things, they're targeted. They're just going to, on day one, when this happens, all of those are going to get hit. Likely a few ships will get sunk. And then it just, boof, this thing will just explode immediately.
The risk of that is very great. I don't know exactly what targets they've decided on. Maybe all of them, or maybe they're going to focus on just the bases. I don't know.
I heard 20 targets were already selected. I saw it on just some YouTube video. Who knows if it's true?
Yeah, but who knows? I don't think the Iranians are going to be telling anybody else.
Hey, I heard that it was on. I heard it was on some IRGC type of. Media that they were trying to just say to as a warning that it went out and public coverage like, look, we're ready for this. We're ready. Right. It does feel like Iran is a lot more confident. They're behaving more confidently.
Yeah, they haven't shown any signs of backing down. I think it was just the other day that Iraqi said, we're going to hit military bases if you strike us. And it was a member of parliament of, the Iranian parliament that said that Yeah, that the Americans had talked about doing one of these symbolic exchanges, and he said, no, the Iranian government just told him, no, you strike us and we're going to hit you back hard. Nothing symbolic. That doesn't work anymore.
Do you think this confidence is stemming somewhat from that perhaps they have capabilities that they did not possess 7 months ago, thanks to the Chinese and the Russians?
That may be. We don't know. That's a big question mark. We don't know. We don't know how much air defense they have. Yeah, they may
or
be
offensive capabilities.
Yeah, that's true. Both things. We don't know. That may be it. Another possibility, though, is just that they realize that they have been backed into a corner, and this has become existential. They have tried showing restraint. They have tried the symbolic exchanges. All these things, and it has failed. Pezeshkian himself was just like bent over backwards trying to be nice to the West and the Americans and to show themselves to be reasonable and whatever. And it just didn't work. And so now they have run out of options. So I think that's part of it too. It's just like, regardless, you say there's our only way, that we're going to survive is if we do fight back hard, if they come in swinging, because we know that they have made it clear what they want to do, that they are set on destroying our country. And, if we agree to some sort of, symbolic exchange this time, it's just they're going to come back in a couple of months, another surprise attack, another, insurrection or whatever. It's those days are over. We understand what this is about. And so we just have to start fighting now.
Yeah, I just feel like Iran should try to start it off on their terms, because it seems like, it's all about waiting for the U.S. Israel to do an attack and then they could justify it. And I almost feel like the U.S. and Israel is trying to goad potentially Iran into striking first to be able to frame it as like, look at Iran, this aggressor in the region, and they're the real problem. But if Iran maybe pushes harder in these negotiations and these demands, that maybe they could give themselves the impetus, for, like we said before, maybe say we're behind Trump's phase 2 part of the peace plan. It's got to be implemented. We got to see this, I'm just wondering if there's some way that instead of, there's always some weird pretext given for the United States or Israel to conduct the strike. Is there any pretext or pretense that Iran can put out so that they can be like, look, this is why we have to do it in a defensive posture? I mean, just looking at it, it's like, hey, your ships, your bases are all around us. It's like, you have to move your ships out, or else, we'll give you 1 week, or else we're going to start shooting, or give you something like this. I don't know, like instead of waiting for this inevitable strike.
Yeah. Well, I think they have to. I mean, it's just like any sort of offensive, preemptive, like we said, it would be justified in so many ways. It's just like, again, the U.S. and Israel has launched these surprise attacks against them in the past, is waging economic warfare against them. They would be justified in striking. But how, they have been demonized to such an extent that anything, even if it's completely justified, will be taken as further proof that this is just an evil regime that's out of control. So they have to tread carefully. I think it's just, they'll have to wait for the other side to make the first move to attack and make it clear that they're the aggressors, and then punch back. I don't know what else they can do. They do. We don't hear about it in the West, but in speaking to the rest of the world, they do tie themselves very closely to what's happening in Gaza, and they say, we're all part of this, and this is why we are being attacked. I mean, recently, Arachi made a speech at it was a gathering, I guess, some sort of Al Jazeera conference, which is sometimes anti-Iranian, by the way, because they tend to have this connection with the Sunni sectarians, the extremists. But yeah, he made it clear, that this is like, it's not just about us. Our fate is tied to Palestine in so many ways, and I think that is a message that is that they have made, within the Middle East, and is pretty well understood, and in the global South as well.
Okay, well, I guess we're just going to have to wait and see, but it sounds like we're probably not going to have to wait that long. Do you expect, if something's going to happen relatively quickly?
Probably, it might be soon after Netanyahu's visit. Again, we don't know exactly what it is that they're trying to get in place, but that's what the reports are, that they're moving around these air defense assets and installing them, and that seems to be the once that particular deployment is completed, then I think probably they'll go ahead with a strike. And I hope against hope it won't happen, but it certainly looks like it's going to happen.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll just have to sit and wait like the rest of the world.
Yeah.
What would you want to move somewhere else? Do you want to talk a little bit about Russia or East Asia?
I thought that we would mention, again, there was this assassination attempt. Fortunately, it failed. The General Alexeyev is recovering, is conscious. I guess is now in stable condition. Apparently, he actually struggled with the would-be assassin, and that saved his life. And his wife was there too, and immediately applied a tourniquet, and that may have saved his life. So, two very brave and quick-thinking individuals there. Now, I thought it's interesting to point out, recently I've talked about the Strangler, is Poklad, the new deputy head of the SBU. And many people say that he's the real head of it. It's often it was a custom during the Soviet Union, and it extended to some pre-Soviet states. So the number two man is the real head, the guy he's the guy in charge of operations. And he used to be the head of the Assassination Division. And again, he used to be a hitman for organized crime. That's what is widely believed and been reported in Ukraine. So it is all the would-be assassin was captured. He got on a plane that flew to Dubai, but the Russians figured it out and notified the UAE. And the UAE authorities arrested him, upon his arrival there, and sent him back to Russia. So they have him, and he's confessed that it was the SBU. He was born in Western Ukraine, during the Soviet years. Became a Russian citizen, but obviously maintained this identity. And it was while he was back visiting in Western Ukraine that he was approached by the SBU, apparently with the help of Polish intelligence, which is rather alarming. But that's what is reported. That was reported in Russian media just today, because this man's son, what is his name? Kupra, I think it is. But his son is actually a Polish citizen, and so they reached him through his son, and then he agreed to become an asset, and eventually he received, according to him, the orders to assassinate Alexeyev back in December. Now, Alexeyev, we know, is the senior, the number two man to the head of the negotiation team that has been conducting the recent negotiations in Abu Dhabi in the UAE. And he may have been, there are reports in the Russian media that he was actually part of the negotiating team. In any case, he has been involved in many negotiations in the past. Like, he's apparently negotiated a lot of prisoner exchanges. He was involved deeply in the negotiations at the Azov steel plant. If you remember that early in the war, there was a number of it was the Azov battalion back then at the steel plant, and he helped to negotiate their surrender. So he has been involved in negotiations, and very possibly he was directly involved in the negotiations in Abu Dhabi. In any case, he's the number two man of the chief negotiator. So this seems like a direct strike on these negotiations, and again, it's almost certainly was carried out under the auspices of the Strangler, Poklad. And you look at that, there's another link with negotiations there. Back at the very beginning, very soon after the start of the SMO, when the negotiations that led to the Istanbul Agreement had begun, they actually started in Minsk, in Belarus, and then moved to Istanbul. But the chief negotiator on the Ukrainian side was assassinated. And it turned out by the SBU. This was in the end acknowledged within Ukraine. And who was involved in that? It was the Strangler. So we have this connection again and again. And in a way, it's really remarkable. I mean, it seems to me amazing, that the Ukrainians would do this. Because I think also Zelensky must have known about it. Zelensky appointed this guy, the Strangler, to be the number 2 man recently. So he knows what's going on. I don't think that they could have done it without his approval. But that he would do that and think that he could get away with it is amazing. Now, there's a lot of anger in Russia about this. I guess Alexeyev was a well-known figure and highly regarded in Russia, especially in nationalist circles. Apparently, he had some sort of association with Prigozhin that got him into trouble, when Prigozhin launched his mutiny. But he was brought back in from the cold afterwards. He kind of spent some time in the proverbial doghouse, but then he was brought back in. And he's, in general, a highly regarded general, very, very highly regarded and very well known. So there's a great deal of anger about this assassination attempt in Russia. And it just remains to be seen what the Russians will do. Now, I guess on one thing you can think, well, the point of this was to stop the negotiations. So if we do stop the negotiations, then we're letting them win. You could make that argument. But on the other hand, it's just like, I think that they should. I mean, that this is just so outrageous that you can't have, one side actually assassinating, the negotiators on the other side and then continue. Like you say that this has to end. Like at the very least, you have to demonstrate that your good faith by handing over. There's one woman that was involved in this, apparently rented an apartment within the apartment building where the assassination attempt was carried out. And she fled to Ukraine and is apparently now in Ukraine. You say you got to hand her over, for example. And if you don't, then we know that, we know where you stand on this and we can't negotiate with you. And I don't see how the Americans could protest. And if the Americans themselves should be furious if they're actually interested in negotiations, but we're not hearing anything. Now, of course, the Ukrainians have done similar things in the past, but this is particularly outrageous. And I think I would be, Putin is so rational, to a point sometimes where he just really seems cold-blooded. I in this case, I just feel like, usually I defend Putin. I think that we're very lucky he has such a rational, he's such a rational being. But if he doesn't actually respond firmly to this, I would be disappointed. It just seems like it would be a mistake.
So right now there hasn't been any formal response. They're kind of mulling it over. I mean, just a general condemnation. I mean, yeah.
Well, they have, yeah. First of all, they had to find out who did it, but now they've found out the guy has confessed, and on tape he wasn't beaten up. At least he didn't show any signs of injury. I saw the video. So I don't know. I'm sure the Russians are talking to the Americans, but who knows? Like we had this. They have already accused Polish intelligence of being involved in this, and we know that the SBU has actually very extensive ties with MI6. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes?
This whole assassinating, decapitating, leadership, going after negotiators, and killing journalists, massacring civilians. I mean, it all feels very IDF-y. It does feel like that's just kind of what we've seen Israel do. Do you think that's one of the reasons that we're seeing this type of behavior, this type of actions that the U.S. is doing, kidnapping presidents, these types of just dropping a bomb on a Houthi tribal gathering, for example, and wiping them out? These type of actions, I just felt like the U.S. didn't engage in these, at least not so openly, blowing up these speedboats or off of Venezuela, or fishing boats. And Like, is it because that Israel's been doing this for so long that we've just kind of like, yeah, this is becoming more and more acceptable?
I think there's quite a bit of truth to that. And again, I think, as I pointed out before, if you go back to like the founding of the neoconservative movement, they were always, Zionism was always a big part of what they were about. That's not all of it, not by any means, but that was part of it. And there was both a desire to make America strong, militarily strong and aggressive, on behalf of Israel. But there was also this admiration for Israel and say that we can learn from them. That was, again, they're the ones to take the gloves off. They're the ones that are not afraid to use military force, to impose their will. And, well, clearly, the U.S. has done that, but there was a reluctance to do it, at least in such an obvious way. There were certain conventions that were observed. There was some sort of a certain amount of restraint, but that seemed to all has been thrown to the winds. And I think it is in part. I don't think you can put it all the blame on the IDF and the terrible example that they've set, but they certainly have. They have normalized carnage in a way. As it's not like the U.S. didn't, for example, what was it? It was the attack on, I can't remember the city, was it Mosul or whatever? That was in Iraq and fighting the ISIS.
ISIS.
ISIS. Yeah, there were, up until the Gaza genocide, that attack was actually on that city, and I'm forgetting the name of the city. Forgive me. Was actually the most costly in terms of civilian casualties in this century. Now the IDF is by far surpassed that. Looking at it in per capita terms by a factor of 5 at least. But that was the worst. So, but the thing is, we didn't celebrate civilian casualties. It was and we generally tried to downplay them and hide them and talk about the necessity of going after ISIS. And I guess you can say the IDF did the same thing. But so it's not like, we didn't have any kind of blood on our hands. But it's just like the IDF in Gaza has taken things to such a new level. Like there's just no sense of shame. There's just no sense of there's no longer the need to feel, now we openly boast about it, these kind of things. Right. We saw that with that strike on the Houthi weddings. We saw that with the boats that are being blown out of the water, and they're still being blown out of the water, by the way, in the Caribbean.
Yeah, it just, I'm afraid because it's almost like a drug user, and they want the other people around them to partake in the drugs they're into because it makes them feel better, more comfortable. It's like if Israel's able to get the United States to stoop to their level, then it just they'll be like, this is fantastic. So I feel like the goal is to get blood on our hands, and once there's enough blood on our hands, then we're just like, okay, well, we're here. I guess we got to move forward. This is. Like the situation that Israel's kind of in, to be honest. I mean, Israel's in this situation where the Netanyahu are a big part of Israel. But I think the reason they're in such a bind is they've gone this far that I think they can't stop, because then they'd have to explain to the world why they committed half a genocide and what are they really all about and what's going on. It's like they've started it and now they can't stop it. And I think their goal is to try to get the United States in that position as well. And we'll just ease them in bit by bit, kill a couple people, break a couple laws, do assassinations, and then all of a sudden, hey, you're with us, let's go, That's kind of what I'm afraid is happening.
Yeah. I think that's part of it, that's part of the dynamic.
God, it's so gross. Well, okay, maybe we can end it there. We'll just every day go to bed, wake up, and just see if it's started yet, It's nuts, Dad. It's really nuts.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, anything else you want to add?
No, I think that we covered enough ground. There are a lot of other things that we can talk about. We'll get to them next time, maybe. We'll see. We can't really cover everything. A lot of things that deserve to be discussed.
Yeah,
but it's just like so much is happening.
Right, and there's this whole, standoff with Iran. This is the big thing. This is this is going to blow, and it's going to, we're not ready for it. No, I don't think anybody is. It's going to get bad fast. I don't think people understand. Okay, well, on that happy note, we'll call it a day. All right,
Okay.
Have a good rest of your day, Dad. Bye bye.
You too. Bye bye.